At Dan's Place here in Washington, D.C., and I am a doctor of physical therapy specializing in performing arts medicine. I'm going to be sharing my screen with the PowerPoint presentation. So today we will be talking about post-COVID-19 syndrome, what it is, and accessibility considerations. I do not have any financial disclosures to report. So before we talk about post-COVID, we need to talk about COVID itself. Many people may know it's a viral illness that was caused by the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus, originally identified in December 2019. It most often causes respiratory illnesses, but can also affect other systems in the body. Following the initial infection, replication of the SARS-CoV-2 virus normally ceases after 4 weeks, and this is important to help us define what post-COVID-19 syndrome is. So post-COVID-19 syndrome has a lot of different names: long COVID, long haul COVID, post-acute COVID, and others. For the purpose of today's talk, we're going to be calling it post-COVID-19 syndrome. It's the persistence of clinical symptoms beyond that 4-week period from the onset of acute symptoms. It's going to be divided into 2 subgroups: a subacute, which is up to 12 weeks from the onset of acute symptoms, and then chronic, which means it's lasting past those 12 weeks. That's when they're really going to be considered a patient of post-COVID-19 syndrome, because sometimes it takes people up to 12 weeks to recover from an acute infection. This syndrome can occur in patients with either severe or mild disease. So this syndrome overall is a multi-system disorder. It's going to start in the respiratory system. This can cause alveolar damage, which leads to one of the hallmarks of this disorder known as dyspnea, which is shortness of breath. This can cause a lot of difficulty for these individuals with what we call activities of daily living, which would be walking, stairs, standing, and then transfers, which could be meaning moving from sitting to standing or laying down to standing. It can cause lung fibrosis and epithelial damage within the lungs. In the cardiovascular system, we're going to see inflammation of the myocardium, arrhythmias, myocardial infarction, which means heart attack, and some chest pain. In the dermatologic system, some people are reporting hair loss and a long-lasting rash. In the renal system, it can cause an acute kidney injury, and some of these individuals will actually end up on short-term dialysis due to these injuries. A larger proportion of this disorder will be dedicated to the neuropsychiatric components. Due to the respiratory portion of COVID-19, it can cause what's called acute hypoxic injuries in parts of the brain known as the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Hypoxic injury just means a lack of oxygen to those areas, which is causing damage to the brain tissue itself. This will lead to hallmark symptoms known as brain fog, or in the medical community, cognitive dysfunction. It causes difficulty with concentration, attention, memory, receptive language, and other parts of executive function. A lot of these people will report what's known as chronic malaise, which is just general not feeling well all over the body. Diffuse myalgia, myalgia means muscle pain. A lot of reports of depression and anxiety symptoms, non-restorative sleep, and loss of taste and smell. So this was highly publicized at the beginning of the pandemic. This is less common with some of the later variants like Omicron, but some people are still suffering from a loss of taste and smell. Others will report migraine-like headaches, and 30% of hospitalized patients will report PTSD symptoms. So what does post-COVID look like in the pediatric population? It has a different name. It's known as multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. And the hallmarks of this disorder are going to be a fever and multi-organ dysfunction causing increased inflammatory markers in those organ systems. To be diagnosed with this disorder, it has to be at least 2 organ systems involved, but the majority of cases are going to show 4 or more organ systems that are going to be involved. It typically will occur 4 to 6 weeks after a child just has an asymptomatic or mild COVID-19 infection. 80% of these patients will have cardiovascular involvement, and the reason for that will actually lead those patients to end up in the hospital. Half of those patients will require a stay in the ICU, and of those patients, 20 to 47% will require mechanical intubation and ventilation. Most of the children will recover, but a few children have passed away from this disease. So looking forward, what does someone look like at 3 months? about 6% of that population will still require what's known as supplemental oxygen use, which means they might be wearing an NG tube and bringing an oxygen with them in certain places. 6% might not seem like a very large percentage. Oh dear, there go my lights. 1 second. It might not seem like a very large percentage, but when you think about the tens of millions of people who have contracted COVID, 6% is actually a large number. At 6 months post-infection, most patients will endorse at least one symptom continuation. The most common are going to be fatigue, brain fog, muscle weakness, and that dyspnea, that shortness of breath. About half will still report that shortness of breath. 10% of individuals are still having a persistence of loss in taste and smell, and about 25% will have continued sleep difficulties, anxiety, and depression. So with post-COVID, over 200 symptoms have been reported to be associated with this disorder. This is a summary slide. On the left-hand side, these are the bolded ones are going to be more of the more common symptoms, but once again, there's literally hundreds of symptoms associated with post-COVID. So when we think about post-COVID-19 syndrome, we also need to think about the racial and ethnic considerations of this disorder. Both post-COVID and COVID-19 are known to disproportionately affect communities of color. When we look at just studies from the United States about people with post-COVID syndrome, 51% of those individuals were Black. In the UK, the studies will show that up to 20% of people with post-COVID will be comprised of the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups there. Those minority ethnic groups are more likely to experience symptoms like dyspnea and mobility deficits compared to white individuals. In terms of dyspnea, they'll have a rate of dyspnea at 42%, whereas white individuals are only showing about 25% of the time. And post-COVID in children is more likely to affect African, Afro-Caribbean, and children of Hispanic origins. So I work here in DC, and they have a lot of great data available to the public. So I pulled this from the DC government website. It's a bar graph, and it's showing by race the total positive cases that have occurred here in the District of Columbia. All of the positive cases, about 48% of the positive cases that have occurred here in our pseudo state were Black residents, whereas white residents only, it was only 23% of the time. So who's at increased risk for post-COVID? People who are admitted to the ICU and require ventilation, pre-existing pulmonary conditions, advanced age, obesity, females at a slightly higher rate, and then those Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. So in terms of prevalence, research is showing about 43% of individuals who were diagnosed with COVID-19 will end up developing post-COVID-19 syndrome, and that percentage will increase to 57% if those people were hospitalized during the acute phase of their infection. So what does that really mean? Here in the United States, that's 30 million people who have been affected by post-COVID-19 syndrome. What that means for us is it means that there's a large group of individuals entering society with a new onset of a disability. Their activities of daily living, getting up, getting dressed, cleaning, shopping, going to work become really difficult challenges. What we know about the disorder is still really limited because it's very new. We're not exactly sure the cause of all the different symptoms, the cure, and technically the timeline. Some people have had symptoms for over a year. We definitely need more research to fully understand the condition. A senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, has introduced a bill into Congress to increase research regarding this syndrome. He himself is a sufferer from post-COVID-19 syndrome. So moving forward, what do we as cultural organizations, what can we do to make things more accessible for this population? So just like a civil engineer, when they're thinking about accessibility, doesn't only want to think about curb cuts. I don't want us to only think about adding seating to our spaces, but we're going to start there. So adaptations to the built environment. Before we talk about where we want to put that seating and what would be best for these individuals, I want to talk a little bit about the height of the seating. An average chair is about 18 inches from the floor to the seat. People with muscle pain, joint pain, fatigue, and shortness of breath have difficulty getting up from low height chairs. So you might want to consider, if you're investing in new seating options for this population, you might want to get a 20-inch chair or a 22-inch chair. It's much easier for people to get out of. I see a lot of times in museums really low benches for people to sit on in the galleries, and those are actually really difficult because they also don't have armrests for people to help push themselves to get up. So where do we want to put that seating? You definitely want to always put seating at an entrance, because just for people to get to your venue, you know, they've gotten dressed, they've been transported, they may have showered for the first time in a few days, and they're probably tired just by the time they get there. So you definitely want it in the entrance. If your organization is known for having long ticketing lines, standing for increased periods of time will cause shortness of breath and will fatigue these individuals. So you want to place seating options throughout your ticketing lines if you're known to have those. You definitely want seating in the lobby, in or outside the restrooms. If you're a zoo or a park, you need to place it through your outdoor space, and it should be shaded to protect them from the sun. And you might want to consider making it a cooling station, adding a fan or a misting machine. And then in museums, you want to think about how often in your galleries you provide seating, because when these people are feeling really tired and worn out and they ask, is there a place where I can sit down? And you say, yeah, sure, it's just 7 galleries down the way. It might be really difficult for them to make it there. So now we're going to look at theaters. So if it's a traditional proscenium seat theater, these people should be seated on either house right or left, closest to the entrance, the restrooms, and the elevator. You really want to limit their stair negotiation. The reason for that is going up and down the stairs is essentially doing a single leg squat over and over and over again. Stair negotiation, almost more than anything else, will cause a lot of shortness of breath for this population. So you definitely don't want to sit them at the bottom of a seating section. You want to sit them closer to the top. They should have an aisle seat, and you want to maybe consider sitting them last, because if you seat them first, which is always our first idea, give them more time to get to their seat, they're going to have to perform what's known as a sit to stand transfer over and over and over again every time someone comes to their row and would like to get to their own seat. And then that could be very fatiguing for them as well. So instead of flashing the lights at 5 minutes, you might want to do 8 or 9 minutes, let the rest of your patrons take a seat, and then invite this group of people to sit down. In terms of museums, you want to think about your rotating exhibits and where you're placing those. If you know an exhibit is going to draw a large crowd, you want to put it in a gallery that's closer to the entrances and easier for these people to access, so we're limiting their energy output. Here is a picture of a traditional proscenium theater. There's the stage at the front and then 3 sections of seating behind it. This mezzanine level here is the 3rd level. This is a theater in DC. To get to this level, you have to walk up a flight of stairs or take the elevator. I put this kind of pink dot here. That's where the elevator is in this theater. And this purple dot is where the men's restroom is. It's the same on the opposite side, but this would be the female's restroom and another elevator. Something you might want to train your box office or front of house to ask questions of people asking for accessible seating is if they're comfortable sharing their gender, you might want to place them on one side of the theater versus the other. If you were to place a male patron on this side, they would have to, this theater is quite large, they would have to walk at least 200 feet across and 200 feet down to get to this restroom. And that can be really, really taxing on their system. The other thing is you don't want to place them all the way down at the bottom of the seating key, because they would have to go up and down those stairs at least twice. And most people will use the restroom, so sometimes even more than that. And then of course, placing them on the edges. This is a map of the National Portrait Gallery here in DC, the 1st floor and then the 2nd floor on the right. It's a full city block, this museum. And a few years ago, some of you might remember the new Obama portraits came out, and they were a really big draw to the portrait gallery, and like literally thousands of people were coming to see these portraits. I remember this very well because one portrait was more accessible than the other. So to see Michelle Obama's portrait, you could enter right here on G Street. Right off the lobby, there's this restroom right here, and she was actually placed right next to the restroom on the wall. So you could walk 10 feet into this museum and see the exhibit. To get to Barack Obama's portrait, you could enter through G Street or F Street entrances. You'd have to walk all the way in, across the atrium, up a flight of stairs or through an elevator, walk through the struggle for justice, and then you would find President Obama's portrait here on the 2nd floor. So obviously one of these portraits was a little bit more accessible than the other. One thing that we could have done to accommodate for this is, knowing that large crowds would come at the beginning of that exhibit, is maybe placing President Obama's portrait on the 1st floor, maybe closer to an entrance with Michelle for 2 to 4 weeks until the crowds come down, and then placing him in the Hall of Presidents later on. Just to prove that I wasn't lying, this is Michelle's portrait. This is the famous picture of the little girl who loved the picture, and that's the restroom I was referencing. So it's right there on that wall. So other adaptations to the built environment. Automated doors. Pulling open and closing large museum or theater doors is really exhausting and takes a lot of strength. But a lot of these people have developed mobility deficits, meaning they might be using a walker, a cane, crutches, a wheelchair, or a rollator. It's really difficult to open a manual door and manipulate that assistive device at the same time. Now, if you don't have the grant funding to install automated doors throughout your space, a really cheap option is a doorstop. Just propping those doors open during the day and closing them after hours. Something you want to consider is the hours of operation for these populations and other people with sensory system disabilities. You might want to provide exclusive hours to prevent sensory overload with lower occupancy. They were doing this a lot in the grocery stores at the beginning of the pandemic for the older population in the early morning. If it's outside, you definitely want to consider heat intolerance. Later in the day, afternoon, it's going to be hot, and that once again will stress the systems in the body and cause them to get more fatigued and wear them out sooner. Also, most of these people will report end of day fatigue, meaning moving through their day, they might start off with more energy, and then by the end of the day, they're more fatigued. They'll have increased brain fog, and they'll stop functioning as well. So you might want to put an event or program earlier in the day. They'll do better at noon than they will do at 7 p.m. at night. In terms of lighting, turning down the lighting a little bit and avoiding strobe effects is really important. You can decrease the likeliness of them having a migraine headache that way. Sound considerations, you want to decrease the volume and bass levels, and there are research showing that noise levels can affect cognitive performance and brain signals, and these people are already having difficulty with those things, so we can limit that. So adaptations to productions and programming. You want to think about the length of the production or program you're having. They're gonna do better with shorter programming. People who are recovering from post-COVID, their first performance they're going to should not be something like Angels in America, right? You need something that's shorter. You want to consider the number and lengths of intermissions you're providing. You should schedule rest breaks throughout the programming just so that they can kind of take cognitive breaks and rest. And if you want to provide programming specific for this population, typically when you have a disorder that's poorly understood, a lot of support groups develop online where they kind of crowdsource information, and this might be a great way to get the word out about specific programming for these populations. In terms of pediatric or children's programming or events, you might want to consider incorporating more fine motor activities versus gross motor. I think when we think about children's programming, we want to get them up and moving and get their energy out. But for these children, it might be more taxing for them. So I would start with a fine motor activity, and if they're too tired to do something that's more gross motor, they can stay at their desk, continue to work on something independently. You definitely want to offer seated rest breaks during the gross motor activities and offer more rest breaks in general throughout activities. If you can limit using screens in general, that will be easier on their auditory and visual systems. In terms of people suffering from brain fog, you definitely want to provide email and text reminders about purchased tickets and experiences, because they might purchase this 3 months ago and completely forget due to suffering memory loss. I usually recommend doing 7 days and then 24 hours ahead of time. So more adaptations. You always want to provide really obvious signage of where areas in your space, you have quiet areas, restrooms. Some spaces are now developing sensory rooms for people suffering from sensory deficits. You want to show where the restrooms are and where there might be first aid available. Due to the pandemic, most of the arts and cultural organizations have developed infrastructure around virtual programming, and you should definitely consider continuing that programming. It allows patrons to pause their performance or event as needed. They can decrease their screen brightness to their comfort, adjust sound levels, and you want to allow multiple days to access the program. So if they get tired after 30 or 45 minutes, they can close their computer and come back to it another day to finish. In my ideal world, every cultural organization would provide something that I call energy conservation maps for the maintenance of energy output. So this would decrease the strain on all of their systems by providing information where it's where it would explain where the best entrances and exits are to enter your space or event, the best places to park close to an entrance or an elevator, and where rest areas and seating is. There go my lights again. This is a view of the National Zoo. And why I wanted to show you this is the National Zoo is actually built on a hill. And so if I'm telling someone with post-COVID syndrome who wants to go to the zoo, where am I going to tell them to start their experience? It's going to be down here at this blue dot at the bottom, because you're going to want them to walk up the hill when they start at the zoo and then down the hill as they become more fatigued. The other thing that you can do is provide that energy conservation map. We know sometimes at places like the zoo, certain animals aren't at home, right? They're inside, or they're away for the winter, or they're at the vet or something like that. So you don't want them to exert more energy going to see something that isn't there. Also, with a lot of museums, there's like highlights at your museums. You know which are the most popular exhibits to see. So you could provide an energy conservation map of those exhibits, explaining what's the shortest distance to walk, avoiding stairs, and incorporating a more efficient way to move through the space so that people can save their energy and get home and not feel sick. I find that the arts themselves can be a really healing experience for most patients, but especially here, if you make the experience more seamless for people and families helping people with disabilities, they're much more likely to continue to be a patron and return. Whereas if you don't give them this information, they go to a parking garage, discover there's no elevator, they have to walk an extra 6 blocks to get to their event or program, and they're exhausted by the time they get there, you might not be getting return patrons because it's just too difficult, it was too hard on them. So we can definitely make small changes to make their experience more seamless. I have a couple pages here of references. And then if you have any questions you would like to ask me, you can find me on LinkedIn or you can send me an email there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Tiernan. That was great. We're now at the question and answer portion of our presentation. If you haven't already, you can enter a question in the chat. Or you can raise your hand, and in just a moment, we will also have Emma on.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emma Allen. I'm the Director of Operations at the Bell Museum in Minnesota. And the Bell Museum is the state's natural history museum that's housed at the University of Minnesota. So that's where I am, and I'm just moderating the discussion and asking Tiernan some questions. I was just as excited to listen to this as probably everyone who's attending, because it is something that I think we're hearing about and that it's happening, but just kind of learning more about this population is really important. Another little tidbit about me is that I have narcolepsy. And so as I'm hearing your symptoms that you were listing, Tiernan, I was like, oh, more people for my club, because our symptoms are kind of similar. And in terms of the fatigue and getting worn out. All right, well, I'll start with just a question about kind of what we're looking at for the future, and if you have any, from your job as a COVID compliance officer, if you have any ideas about how we can prepare our staff and visitors for mask mandates that are coming and going.
Yeah, so depending region, like mask mandates are very regional currently, and most are being lifted right now because we saw a large drop in the Omicron case studies. So every organization right now is making decisions on whether they're going to keep their mask mandate or not. I can say at Dance Place, we are keeping our mask mandate for now. You should expect that mask mandates will come and go. And I would just always have a policy ready to provide to your public that's really easy to understand on when you're going to remove your mask mandate and then once again require it. For me, thousands of people every day are still getting COVID. And so it's still out there and it's still being transmitted, tens of thousands actually. And for people who might have autoimmune disorders, might be going through cancer treatments, might have other reasons where they're immunocompromised, if we're wanting our spaces to be accessible, they should be accessible to all people with the same safety level. I know that there's a lot of opinions about that. So this is something you should talk to your board about and people who you work with and kind of gauge where your comfort level is. And you also want to think about the communities that you serve, right? So if you're serving lower income areas with larger racial diversity, those have higher rates of COVID. So you might want to keep your mask mandate longer because you're going to be protecting them better. So there's a lot of different ways to move forward. And I always think that it's best to explain your reasoning when you reinstate a mask mandate, because yeah, sometimes people are annoyed and upset about it. But if you explain, hi, like we have a lot of immunocompromised people who like to come to our museum, our park, whatever, few people are going to fight back on you with that.
We have a question from the audience. Jess Tom, who was a keynote at an earlier LEAD conference, if people remember that name. But she's asking about staff and artists that work at the organizations that have that are having these symptoms, because obviously we're not exempt.
Yeah, of course. So, obviously notifying your HR department that you need accessibility accommodation is step one, but you can also help them to pad their schedule with what I call active rest breaks, which, is an oxymoron, but, they need to schedule time throughout their day to step away from their computer and step away from phone calls and just be sitting in maybe a darker room and take a 10-minute rest break. They might also need to adjust what hours they work. So they might start an hour later so they can sleep in a little bit more in the day, or they might want to start earlier because they notice that their fatigue on set is later in the day. So those are easy things that you can do for your staff to be more understanding if they're struggling with this. If they have a really physical job, you might want to have someone assess kind of if they can move to something that we call light duty, so they're not doing as much heavy lifting. And then you want to definitely use things like white noise machines and limit their sensory input, because that can really tax the neurological system.
That brings me to another question, which is when you have disabilities or conditions like this that have this whole myriad of symptoms, sometimes when you're trying to make accommodations for them, you end up with sort of dueling accommodations where the white noise may be super helpful for some employees, but other employees are much more sensitive to it and can really hear that, and it's very distracting. And I'm just wondering if you have run into any other sort of dueling accessibilities when you're talking about such a wide variety of ways that this manifests.
Right, and that's something you want to think about in terms of your space. So if your company works in cubicles, then yeah, putting white noise machines could be like a dueling disability problem. And if that's the case, I really employ people to use headphones. AirPods these days have a noise cancellation feature, or you can have them just wear their own headphones and play white noise through their computer, etc. if there's issues with that. If you're in a space where they're in their own office and can close their door and do things like that, that's something where you can separate the spaces in terms of that.
And Christina from Chicago, it's nice to see your name, Christina, has a question, and it's related to a question that I have about reaching out to this community. And it's funny, in disability, we often talk about the disability community as though we're all hanging out at each other's houses. It's not necessarily the case. But how to let folks know that they're welcome, are there things that you can sort of signal, because as she's saying that some people may not identify themselves as having a disability, or because they're new to this whole, oh, now I need assistance with these things. And yeah, are there, and I also open this up to people in the group, because I know that there's a lot of people from a lot of different organizations here. if they have been successful in reaching out to this community too. So I'll start with you, Tiernan.
Yeah, so one thing I had mentioned was those online support groups. They're actually quite large and there are regional ones. So you could directly reach out to those online support groups and say, hi, we have these special programs directed at, people who are suffering from this disorder. Also on your website, you can always have a drop-down ticker explaining at the top, because yeah, most people go to the homepage of the website, but if they don't consider themselves to have a disability or realize that they have a disability yet, they might not think, oh, there's probably an accessibilities page on their website that I could then look to. So there's something you can put at the top of your website and just say, here's where to look for more information about, accommodations that we can make.
Great. Do you have any takers in the audience? This is great. Lorena just posted a comment. Lorena, do you want to just say this out loud?
Sure. Something I learned when advertising for programs for people with vision loss, that if we described what the program was, we got a lot more people who just could use a stool during a program and a nice slow experience looking at art. So I was just saying, describing the qualities of the experience, what's going to happen in the experience in some detail, rather than saying this is for this group, can really help people select the kind of experience they want and maybe a little bit more inclusive in hitting some, like I know that someone who's looking for early hours for sensory processing disorder, for their family, it's going to be looking in a different place, to your point, Christina, than someone who has a chronic illness. But by describing the program or what's going to be happening can really, can hit some of those notes.
Derek offered that content warnings, especially for light, sound, trauma, etc. I think that's a really good point. And Tiernan, I'm wondering if you've run into anything. I thought that reminding people about their tickets was such a good tip, because a lot of us have brain fog, I think, right now. And I could certainly use that. But also wondering if there are other things that are common, sort of problematic things in performances or museums that might be good to warn people or warn folks about.
Yeah, I feel like kind of what Derek touched on, the light, the sound, the trauma, just kind of how when you go and see a performance, if, there's going to be a loud bang or like in plays when there's a gunshot in the play, that typically will warn you at the beginning of the performance. That's something, or if there's strobe lighting effects, typically they'll warn people for epileptic reasons about those sorts of things. You want to warn people about those as well. But yeah, I think in terms of like severity of light and sound, and then obviously the placement of things and exertion of energy. And I think what it was Lorena said, just really giving people a detailed image of what they're walking into, it'll really calm down their anxiety and fear, because some of these people eventually develop anxiety about leaving the house and not being able to sustain themselves out in public. And I think if you give them a really detailed image of like, this is what you're coming for, and this is what you'll see, and you should expect to walk 500 feet to your seat, or we have elevators accessible for you, or if you need some organizations, like I know the Kennedy Center has a wheelchair transfer from curb to seat, so you can make sure that they know about those accessibility accommodations if they're worried about getting to their event or program.
Yes, and Hannah's point about Derek was just saying that she agrees, and don't make the content warning tiny and hard to read in the corner. Yes. And Jess, thank you. Jess from Tourette's Hero, she has posted an article that she wrote, No Burnout in Biscuit Land, which is a great title. Love it, Jess. And just as a resource to give to people to think about anti-burnout steps. Emily, do you want to pipe in? I can read this too, but love to
I
hear
think that she's talking about the wheeled walkers with a seat. They're called a rollator. So some people will have a rollator, and they're great because they can just lock them and sit down and take a break wherever they need. But not everyone will have one, but that's a great option too if they're trying to walk through a museum. If you guys have a few available for people to use, they'll take their seat around with them. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. I would love that.
Our museum is not very big, but we noticed that sometimes people will start out because of the size and think like, oh yeah, I've got this, I can do this. But then get a little ways in and then want to borrow the walker or the rollator. So I think having them disperse is also another thing. So volunteers don't have to go all the way downstairs to get it. And it just seems like, oh yeah, we expected people, this happens all the time. This is normal.
Yeah, so if you have like a storage closet, maybe in the midway point of your museum or something like that, you can keep one or two in there just in case someone does need it. There's a lot of great options, but you can always just incorporate them throughout the space. So people, so it's hard when there's a curator or someone monitoring a gallery to leave the gallery and then go all the way to the front just to get that one item for people.
And there's a bunch of good comments here. Beth had mentioned putting information under both visit and accessibility so that people, I think that's great when we're talking about a new population that may not have the vocabulary that we're used to using. And so they're just like, I'm just going for a visit and they're not looking on the access page. And Emily pointed out that the wheeled walker is a helpful visual signal that you might need some help or extra space. So those are both excellent comments.
Definitely always instruct a patient who has a mobility deficit. They might be able to get around their home really easily without an assistive device, but whenever they go in the community, I say, even though you might not need it, this will protect you from other patrons from bumping into you or running around you. So it is a visible sign because there are, and so much of post-COVID is what we call an invisible disability, right? Not everyone's going to realize that that's what's going on, and there's tons of invisible disability. And that will be a signal to other people to, give you more space. So I think that's a great tip, Emily.
You touched on this a little bit, but I think there's this temptation in organizations to be really celebratory about like, woohoo, we're over, let's burn these masks, and moving on. And there's also, the talk about returning to normal. And for so many people, like the 30 million people that you have been talking about today, but also our immunocompromised populations, or even people that are just still fighting COVID or getting COVID, like they don't have the opportunity to move on. And it's, so I just wanted to know if you had any experience, Tiernan, with your organization kind of balancing that. Yes, we're happy that things are getting better message with, but we understand that there are still people that are just really in the midst of this and still isolated because of it.
Right. And so for our organization specifically, we've just maintained our mask mandate. But I think for other organizations, there is this large societal push to return to normalcy. And in that regard, I think there's a couple of things that you can do if you're in an area of the country that is really mask averse or something like that. And I think the two easiest things to do is to provide masks at the front of in the entrance or in the lobby of your space. So if someone comes and is immunocompromised and simply just forgot, oh, hey, I'm going to a place where there's going to be a lot of other people there, they can at least protect themselves. And then the one thing that I would really encourage is to make the mask mandate mandatory for your staff. Because when people come into your space and they see that the staff is wearing masks, it encourages them to then put on a mask as well, or feel less It's funny how many people, adults that I speak to, who say they feel peer pressured when they go somewhere and no one else is wearing a mask. They feel uncomfortable. These are full on adults, like, members of society, and they feel peer pressured because no one else is wearing a mask, so they don't put it on. But if at least the staff is on, I feel like people will feel a lot less peer pressure to take theirs off or not put theirs on. So those are two easy things that you can do to make other people feel more comfortable.
Jess made a really good point about when we're putting these different accommodations or services that we're going to offer into practice, just describing what it is instead of dictating who uses it. And so not saying this is specifically for people with this exact diagnosis. I think that's such a good point, Jess, like, because there's creativity that happens where you find that something that you may have intended to serve one population is actually really useful to another population. And so she ended it by saying allowing space for people to experiment with access is important, especially with new impairments. I agree. I mean, because obviously the people who are the experts are the people experiencing it and are gonna have ideas. Yeah, Beth, many staff who have been on the front line with visitors for 8 hours a day want to wear masks. Yeah, I know we're still providing N95s for all of our staff, and they're not only do they want to wear a mask, they want an N95.
Yeah, and that's super important because those people who are the frontline workers, they're exposed to the most diverse populations and high volume. The more people you interact with, the more you're at risk to develop COVID itself. So I definitely understand that.
Any other, something just happened in chat. Any other questions from our audience today? We have a lot of regions of the country represented here, and I know that how COVID in general is being handled both politically and socially is very different based on where you are. So especially if you're in an area of the country where you're like, well, not everything you're saying rings true where I am. Love to hear from you. Giving some teacher wait time here. Well, keep thinking and raise your hand or use that hand raising function, or put something in the chat if a question comes up. But another question. So a lot of these accommodations that are put in place to support people with post-COVID, as Jess was pointing out, can serve a lot of other populations. Have you noticed specific examples of things that your organization has done where you're like, oh, we did this to either comply with COVID or for something, and then you've noticed somebody using it in an interesting way?
That's a tough question. I think in terms of a lot of these, we talked about, sensory deficits. There's a lot of what we kind of alluded to earlier with the invisible disabilities. Most of these things can be helpful for a lot of different types of disabilities, from immunocompromised people to people who are post-stroke to post-COVID patients to people who have some motor deficits as well. I'm trying to think if we've done anything specific at Dance Place that would allude to multiple different populations. Kind of drawing a blank on that
right now. Well, Jess's example in her comment was taking advantage of using audio description because she was in a lot of pain and needed to come out of her chair, but then her view was not as good. And so she was able to use the audio description and still understand what was going on, which I thought was a great example. Personally, I have appreciated a lot of the sensory things that people have been doing in the warnings about sound. And my particular superpower, thank you, Jess, for that language, is cataplexy, which is caused by surprise. So I go paralyzed and fall from that. And so that all of you that work at theaters and put out those signs that say there will be gunshots, thank you. I need that. I need to know that I need to put in earplugs before your show, and it's very helpful. Yes. Derek, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, just a lot of these accessibility needs that have been mentioned are easily applicable in everyday functioning for both neurodivergent folks and chronically ill folks, like a lot of things about the conservation of energy and the consideration of energy and how, you know, we run on finite energy throughout the day and we will fatigue ourselves. That's clearly something the rest of us spoonies that we call ourselves in the community have to address, that like, I don't know if I have enough energy to be going up so many stairs in this institution. So that's like one thing. And also a lot of sensory needs, sensory rooms, a lot of being very aware of the crowds and the environment around us. And when we have overwhelming of either color or people or scent, like that affects a lot of neurodivergent folks. So like, yeah, just a lot of these needs already are like, yeah, they're just kind of needs that we understand that we require, both neurodivergent and chronically ill and disabled folks. So yeah, like these are easily applicable for kind of ongoing considerations beyond accessibility for long COVID patients.
Thank you. Emily, I also like to invite you. Would you like to speak?
I don't have much to say beyond what I say in the chat, which is I had a little tachycardia spell at work and just in the offices. And my office mates, some of whom I've worked with for decades, didn't know how to summon the nurse. I do, because I've taken the CPR class that gets offered irregularly and maybe only to a dozen or so people, but just making sure people are aware a little more. A refresher is always good for this generally, but especially with COVID, it might be helpful to have that. It would certainly be reassuring, because I otherwise feel like I could drop dead and no one will notice.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I know at Dance Place, we do require staff to be CPR certified, especially in the education department, but then also something called basic life support. And so that would be something that where it's, you know, you might not have needed CPR due to tachycardia, but what do you do if someone's in shock or if someone passes out? So maybe providing those trainings for your staff. And then simple trainings in regards to dyspnea itself. If you notice that someone is really like having a difficult time breathing and they're standing and walking in your space, you immediately want to sit them down. So if you can sit them down and then lay them down somewhere, that will help them recover faster than if they stay standing. So just really simple things that you can teach your staff to, if there is a small emergency or they're just having trouble. You always just want to get them in a more supported position. But yeah, I definitely recommend that, you know, front of house, frontline workers might want just that really basic emergency response training. And then definitely knowing how to call the nurse, how to get to first aid, and what to do in an emergency at your place of work, always important.
Thank you.
And then just one more thing on that, making sure your staff knows where the AED is. So if you do need to provide CPR, especially if it's a large organization, making sure they know where they're located throughout the space. That's something you'll probably talk about in your CPR training, but just something to consider, reminding people, hey, this is where the AED is if someone does does require that.
And Tiernan, can you explain AED for people who?
Yeah, it's essentially those pads that you'll put on someone's chest if they go into cardiac arrest to restart their heart. So it's part of CPR and resuscitation, and it's usually hanging on a wall in a box that says AED. It's usually by fire extinguisher, but different places and different buildings.
And the great thing about most of them now is that when you pull them out, they lead you through it and they tell you exactly what to do, and you can't harm somebody whose heart is like, you know, on TV you see that clear, and you can't. If you do it on somebody whose heart doesn't need it, you won't harm them if you're concerned about that. So we always do a demonstration every year with our staff with this is what the voice will tell you to do.
Perfect.
And another thing to know is that they come in child size. If you're a children's museum or you're a zoo, and having both is not a bad idea.
Yeah, and in the AED, there's usually pediatric pads and then adult pads. So the pediatric ones are smaller. So that's usually the sign there. And then, yeah, Beth, they'll have a PDF of my slides and they can send that out to you.
Well, this was a really great discussion, and thank you all for being here and for sharing your stories and your resources. And Tiernan, thank you so much for telling us all. This is a lot of really good information, and just like that, I'm going to be bringing it back to people in my organization. And I'm wondering if someone from the Kennedy Center, we have 3 minutes left, wants to say a little bit about the LEAD conference, which is.
Hi, everyone. This is Hannah. I'll say a little bit about the LEAD conference. It is happening August 1st through 5th in Raleigh, North Carolina. And really hope that a lot of you or all of you will be there. And when we refer to a lightning talk, that's actually a type of session at LEAD that is a very condensed, kind of packed full of information session. Thank you, Tiernan.
I know, I was like, this is like, gotta talk really fast. I can get this all done in 20 minutes.
I think this one clearly deserves a lot more time, but it was really wonderful. You guys were great, and a lot of good conversation in the chat. Another big part of the LEAD conference is networking and discussing things with colleagues and sharing and learning information. If you're not familiar with it, LEAD actually stands for Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disability, and it really truly is an exchange. So thank you. And thank you so much, Tiernan and Emma and everyone who asked questions and made comments. It's great.